Yes. Welcome to my ramblings on Nepal. Nepal's most special attribute may be its flag, being the only one in the world which isn't either a square or a rectangle. But it's also home to Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world. And its entire northern Himalayan regions are known as the ceiling of the world. But down south on the border with India, you have the rich plains in the Terai Arc landscape, home to famous national parks like Chitwan, the oldest national park in the country, with prime habitat for iconic species like tigers, rhinos, elephants, sloth bears and leopards. And today's ramblings will focus on the resurgence of one of the most adored big cats, the tiger, which is classified as endangered by the IUCN. 100 years ago, we used to have around 100,000 of these majestic animals roam their extensive ranges in 13 different countries. But sadly, we've already lost 3 subspecies, and today we're down to about a total of 3,900 individuals. So if you've watched Tiger King or not, you'll still be shocked to know that there are more tigers in captivity in the US alone than there are in the wild across the world. How have we managed to lose so many? Well, in the mid-20th century, thousands were killed by hunters. Even King George V boasted on killing 39 tigers over a 10-day trip to Nepal. But since then, tigers have really lost an estimated 95% of their historical ranges. Their land destroyed, degraded and fragmented by human activities. Forests cleared for agriculture and timber, as well as the building of roads. Humans and tigers also continually compete for space. And when their prey gets scarce, they leave their protected areas and head into human-dominated lands, often killing livestock, which sort of unsurprisingly then either gets them killed or captured by farmers as retribution. However, the most significant and immediate threat to these beautiful creatures has been poaching, with every part of a tiger being found in illegal wildlife markets across Asia, most often used in medicines, remedies and even fashion. So, back in Nepal, by 1937, the once undisturbed, pristine jungles and floodplains, the perfect habitat for tigers and all this other wildlife, it had basically all been cleared for a growing population. And that meant that there were less than 60 rhinoceros and 60 tigers left. And at that point, Chitwan National Park was formed as a sort of refuge for these remaining populations. And now in 2020, Nepal had 600 rhinos and 235 tigers across all of these national parks in the Terai Arc landscape, with more than half of them being in Chitwan National Park itself, which has attracted over 600,000 visitors in its time. Mr. Gurung, the country director for the WWF, has told me how they managed to achieve this.
Everyone worked together. There's a huge political willingness from the Prime Minister's level, having the highest level of political will, then bringing all the machinery of the government coming together in terms of protecting in the parks by the Nepal Army together with park officials, then controlling trade by the Nepal police and together with other intelligence community, and from the postal to all these armed police force everywhere. That's the control of the trade. And then more importantly, the local communities in the park and around are the critical, not only provided the intelligence, not only provided the support, they actually participated actively to increase the number of tigers in particular and wildlife in general.
And down in Chitwan, I met with the team from the Nepal Tiger Trust, and I stayed with Babaram in his village of Magauli. Babaram is a local Tharu ethnic person whose lineage has lived in this area for centuries. And he recalled of years gone by in his life where there were just a couple of thatched houses, lots of mud, and we had to sleep by the crops at night to scare away rhinos. So I think a lot has changed for the better since then. I went and joined the 2 tiger trackers on their daily duties, roaming around the park, collecting data of tiger tracks to help understand the population and their movement. 10 hours and probably about 25 kilometres of walking through the forest gave me a lot of time to try and understand and gauge the local perception of tiger conservation. Because as Mr. Gurung said, community is incredibly important to the global tiger landscape. But as I learned, it wasn't always the case. Throughout the first decade of the programme in particular, the community's interests were largely ignored. Even Baburam's parents were displaced from their home to create the national park and restricted from entering to gather vital supplies like firewood, grass and food. And this, as you can imagine, caused quite a lot of unrest and resentment towards conservation, by the local communities being shut out of the lands that they've been using all of their lives, without seeing any tangible benefits from these conservation outcomes. So it's no surprise that some of them then went on to support the poachers. These rural communities further suffered, and still do, through animals like boar and deer coming and eating their crops, and tigers and leopards taking their livestock. But since the 90s, the government has come to understand the role of the locals in this ownership of the park and the conservation within that. They're now allowed to use a buffer zone in between the park and the villages. I mean, there are fences being built as well to try and reduce that human-wildlife conflict, and there are even compensation schemes put in place if livestock do get taken. But most importantly, in my opinion, 50% of all of the park fees for all of the visitors goes back to these communities for sustainable development. What this means is that it incentivises the local people to want to have a richer ecosystem in the park, because then more tourists come, because obviously you've got a better chance of seeing tigers, and then they get more money for all of this. So alongside the work that the Nepal Tiger Trust are doing on monitoring, they're also educating the local populations on the importance of preserving tigers. Because as we just said, 1, more tourists, more money, and 2, imagine your kid coming up to you wondering why there are no tigers or rhinos there anymore. So these create sort of local anti-poaching volunteer groups which join alongside the strong government contingent of 800 park staff and 8,000 army personnel who are trying to rid Nepal of this horrible tiger trade and the illegal wildlife trade in general. And recently, with these efforts, there have been 3 years of 365 days of no rhino poaching. Get in! So, back in 2010, world leaders from the 13 tiger range countries, India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Myanmar, China, Indonesia, Malaysia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia and host Russia, all participated in the World Tiger Summit in St. Petersburg. The result was monumental, with £330 million pledged to save the remaining wild tiger populations, with the ambitious goal of doubling them worldwide by 2022. So with all this hard work that I've just been speaking about, it's looking pretty good for Nepal. They're on track to meet the target of 250 tigers, with tiger populations increasing in all 5 national parks. But what's going to happen next, I've wondered? The requirements of a tiger means that all of these existing protected areas will end up having a finite carrying capacity of how many tigers can live there. And is Nepal just going to get to a point where that's it? Just got to fence them in and these national parks sort of become zoos? To be honest, it's not often you get to look forward to a scenario like this in general anyway. And it sort of shows what success you can have if the global community comes together and the country fully embraces conservation. It's not the same everywhere though. Tigers have all but disappeared in Laos, Vietnam and Cambodia. But what's needed now to make sure these national parks don't just turn into wild zoos is more space. And as Nepal looks to graduate from a less economically developed country to a developed one, space is going to be one thing that's very under pressure. From my chats with WWF, alongside the partnerships with India trying to facilitate movement across the border, within Nepal their focus is now on the interconnectivity of these national parks, creating wild corridors through which tigers can interchange freely between protected areas, sort of looking for territory of their own. Already 8 corridors have been set up, and camera traps have been showing that this is actually working and it's making a difference, with a tiger being spotted at its highest altitude in the country yet. But yet again, the successes of these corridors put at risk more human-wildlife conflict. And more than ever now, communities need to be seeing the tangible benefits from the sacrifices and commitments that they're making. So, livelihood initiatives like forest-based enterprises, using their traditional knowledge of the forest to sell products, and also things like creating homestays, they all offer these economic incentives for conservation. And then I suppose this all comes back to the role of tourism again, potentially, with communities relying on more tourists coming into the area, and therefore so does conservation. And so if we want to take part in these things, these activities going into the national parks, we do have to remember that these are wild areas, so we have to behave accordingly. And trust me, I was literally up a tree every time I saw one of the 11 rhinos across my 10 hours. But really, in general, it's such a nice feeling to start to see successes like this, restoring these amazing species and their habitats. So let's just hope, come 2022, that many more countries are starting to be like Nepal with growing populations. Up the Nepal, ramblings out. And to keep up to date with everything, make sure you give all of these a follow.